Hello, and welcome to Reinventing Democracy for the 21st Century. We're delighted to present this session that showcases the scholarly collaboration between the University of Chicago's Division of the Humanities and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And now I would like to briefly introduce David W. Oxtoby, the president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. David is President Emeritus of Pomona College and served as a visiting scholar at the Harvard Graduate School of Education before becoming president of the American Academy. As the 9th president of Pomona College, David has been recognized as a leader in American higher education for advancing environmental sustainability, increasing college access, cultivating creativity, and pursuing academic excellence within an interdisciplinary liberal arts environment. Previously and memorably, he served at the University of Chicago as Dean of the Division of the Physical Sciences and the William Rainey Harper Distinguished Service Professor of Chemistry. And now I'll ask David to introduce this Humanities Day session, the moderator, and multiple panelists.
Thank you, Anne. It's my pleasure to be here to welcome American Academy members along with the community in Chicago, where, as Anne mentioned, I spent many happy years, and to introduce this important discussion on the future of our democracy. I want to begin by thanking you and the whole University of Chicago Humanities Day team for this invitation, for all the hard work that went into organizing today's event. I want to also thank the American Academy's University of Chicago Program Committee, especially its chair, Dr. Young-Ki Kim, for conceiving of this program. I'm proud that members of the American Academy are so committed to bringing attention to these important issues. Today's program takes its title from the final report of the Academy's Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, Our Common Purpose, Reinventing Democracy for the 21st Century. Under the leadership of Commission co-chairs Danielle Allen, Stephen Heinz, and Eric Liu, the bipartisan commission began 3 years ago with the understanding that there was a prevailing sense of crisis among the American people, a feeling that has only intensified since we began our work. The Our Common Purpose report was developed with the guidance of leaders in academia, civil society, politics, business, and philanthropy, and offers a detailed plan for how we can work together to build a fresh collective commitment to the practice of democratic citizenship, to American constitutional democracy, and to one another. The 31 recommendations proposed in the report touch all sectors of American life, from our civic institutions to social media. They are not only informed by the expertise of our commission members, but by the widest range of voices ever consulted in Academy history. Over the span of 2 years, the commission conducted nearly 50 listening sessions around the country to gather the stories, experiences, and frustrations of a diverse array of Americans. Those perspectives are reflected in the recommendations at every level. The commission challenges us to achieve significant progress toward these recommendations by 2026, our nation's 250th anniversary. Conversations like today's are an important step in making this goal a reality. I'm glad so many of you have joined us, and I'm grateful to our panelists for their contributions. Together, we can meet the challenges of our 21st century and emerge as a more resilient nation. It's now my pleasure to introduce those panelists, starting with our moderator, Eric Slaughter. Eric is Deputy Dean of the Division of the Humanities, Director of the Carla Scherer Center for the Study of American Culture, and Associate Professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Chicago. Eric will be joined by William Howell, a new member of the American Academy this year, the Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics at the Harris School of Public Policy, Chair of the Department of Political Science at Chicago, the Director of the Center for Effective Government, and co-host of Not Another Politics podcast. Tracy Mears, the Walton Hale Hamilton Professor, Founding Director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale University Law School. Tracy was elected to the Academy in 2019 and was previously the Max Pam Professor and Director of the Center for Studies in Criminal Justice at the University of Chicago Law School. Susan Stokes, the Blake Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Political Science, Faculty Director of the Chicago Center on Democracy at the University of Chicago, and a member of our Academy. And finally, Diane Wood, Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago Law School, a member of the Commission on Practice of Democratic Citizenship that authored Our Common Purpose. Diane serves as Chair of the Academy's Council. Unfortunately, Tom Ginsburg had a last-minute change and is unable to join us today. So thank you to all our panelists for their time today. Now let me turn things over to Eric Slaughter. Eric.
Thank you so much, David and Anne, or President Oxtoby and Dean Robertson. Although I think we're going to be embracing democracy and maybe losing some of the titles today. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to join these distinguished panelists and American Academy members for this discussion of our common purpose, reinventing democracy for the 21st century, as part of the University of Chicago's annual Humanities Day. In the report, the American Academy's Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, chaired by Daniel Allen, Stephen Hines, and Eric Liu, provides both an assessment of the crisis of democracy in the United States and a set of 31 very specific recommendations to support, enhance, and indeed reinvent democracy. Democracy, as the report notes, has been reinvented in America before. The report envisions, hearkening back to the founding of the United States in the 18th century, and to the second founding after the Civil War, and to the third founding brought about by the Civil Rights Movement in the 20th century, nothing less than a fourth founding for our own time. A majority, 19 of these recommendations, concern reforms to formal political institutions and processes designed to achieve equality of voice and representation, empower voters, and ensure the responsiveness of government. The final dozen recommendations take us beyond the reform of political institutions to address the social, civic, and indeed cultural infrastructure of democracy in America, with the hope of dramatically expanding the civic bridging capacity of our civil society associations, building a civic information architecture that supports common purpose, and inspiring a culture of commitment to American constitutional democracy and to one another. We will not be able to address all 31 of the Commission's recommendations, but over the next 45 minutes or so, the panelists will address questions about the state of American democracy, as well as some of the specific proposals the Commission has made in its report. Specifically, we will focus the discussion on both the challenges our panelists identify for democracy, being careful always to explain the criteria they use for their evaluations, as well as their assessment of some of the possible solutions put forward by this Commission. We are live today, and we are counting on those of you participating and watching this session to provide us with questions, comments, and responses. If you would like to raise a question for the panel or a particular panelist, please do so through the Q&A feature. We will turn to your questions for the final portion of this session. I'd like us to begin with how things look to our panelists today. This report, based on 2 years of conversations around the country, was released in June of this year. It reflects some sense of the possible impacts of COVID-19 as a public health and economic crisis, and includes some worries about voting in this year's elections, especially. But it does not broach the national disconversation and protests over racial justice and policing, or the conversations around the Supreme Court and the executive branch that have emerged as defining features of our national conversation and of the 2020 elections. So I'd like to put each of our panelists on the spot just briefly at the opening here and ask them some questions about the past few months. So Professor Mears, Tracy, if you will, I'd like to start with you. The word police appears only once in the report. You've spent your career examining the relation between communities and policing. In June, you published a piece in the Atlantic magazine in which you invited Americans to have a conversation about what democratic policing can and should be, especially around the question, what are police for? I'd like to start with that. Why is that the first key question for you? And do you have an answer?
I have lots of answers, but you just said that we need to be short. So I'll tell you why I think it's a key question. And the reason is that there are two institutions actually that have traditionally taught people in this country about citizenship, educated them about citizenship. One is the obvious institution, schools, public schools in particular. But another key institution in this country is the criminal justice system. And I wrote a piece in the Annals of Political and Social Science Research a few years ago talking about how the criminal justice system educates citizens. Police, of course, are a key institution within the criminal legal system, and how police treat people tells them a lot about how they're valued by society as a general matter, but also how the state understands them, and therefore how they understand their own role as a citizen in society. Police in this country it's grown up as a set of informal arrangements, despite the fact we call ourselves to be a country governed by the rule of law. In a lot of ways, the ways in which policing has grown up in the United States has not actually been consistent with that idea. And so I think it's important to understand, if we are going to move forward in a context of democracy for everyone, that we have to take our relationship with policing seriously, and therefore have to think very seriously about what we understand police to be, and not just as armed first responders who show up in a context of emergency.
Thank you very much. Professor Stokes, Sue, the word protest appears only 3 times in the report. Certainly it might have appeared more frequently had the report come out just a few months later. You've spent a part of your career studying protests as a form of political participation, and you've published an article in the Wilson Quarterly earlier this year with the title, "Why Protest?" How do you address that question? And how do you think about the relationship between protests, elections, and democracy?
Thanks, Eric. That's a wonderful question, and it's great to be here today. Look, people have different views on protests, including scholars have different views of protest, and there's room for legitimate disagreement. Some believe that protests are a sign of a failure of democracy, that under democracy, conflicts are channeled through institutions such as political parties, congresses, the courts, and the like. Some might add to that in a kind of, James Madison, the way he thought about factions, that, he didn't like them, but getting rid of them, the cure would be worse than the disease. That, eliminating faction would mean an unfree society. There are some who feel that way about protests as well. My own view is different. My own view, and this is in part based on the research that we've conducted over the last few years, is that protests are an important tool that citizens get in democracy. So we get several tools. We get to vote. We get to participate in civic organizations, and we get to express our views publicly. And we get a right to peacefully protest, join demonstrations, go to the streets when we wish to do so. Now, I think that history has many examples of protest movements that are linked to concrete public policy demands, a kind of agenda of public policy demands, playing a really important role in keeping pressure up to make important changes. And the best example of that in this country is the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So protest was not an end in itself. It was an important kind of expression of political views, but it was also a tool that was meant to press a series of demands that would not have been effectively pressed had that tool not been available. Now, in our own day, in our own moment, we have, the article you mentioned, we described 2019 as the year of the protest. It was a remarkable year in which, for a confluence of reasons I can talk about, protest movements were more frequent and involved more people around the world in every world region than any other time. And then the pandemic happened, and the protests sort of, suddenly the streets and squares around the world went quiet. But that didn't last. And it didn't last because in various countries, including our own, very, very powerful reasons to return to protests emerged, and especially after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Now, again, the movements like Black Lives Matter has put a number, is kind of a marriage of a tool, which is protest and demonstration, and a set of demands, demands of the kind that Tracy is an expert in and was alluding to. Some of them, people will like, some people won't like. I think the some will demand quite a bit of agreement. Others will be more controversial. I have to say that the sort of defunding of the police idea, if you kind of repackage that as a sensible scope of police action, that's something that actually would get a lot of support from the police forces themselves. I've never been so sad as when I heard an interview with Joe Prude, the brother of Daniel Prude, the man experiencing a psychiatric crisis in Rochester earlier this year, who ended up, Joe called the police to get help for his brother and never saw his brother alive again. Joe will never forgive himself. He blames himself for the death of his brother because he made the mistake of calling the police. Now that's a terrible situation. And so, I think that in the United States, as in other countries, protests do and can play an important role. They're more effective when they're peaceful, and activists mostly know that and therefore have an incentive to keep them peaceful. They aren't always peaceful. They certainly aren't always for in the name of objectives that we would all agree to. People protest for good reasons and bad reasons, just like we elect good leaders and sometimes we elect bad leaders. But I think it's a very important tool in the sort of the toolkit of citizens.
Thank you, Sue. Professor Howell, I want to turn to you, Will. The report mentions the US president only 4 times. In fact, it mentions the American Academy's president more frequently than the US president. And all of the mentions are in the context of Supreme Court appointments. Some today worry that one of the central challenges to American democracy is the power of the executive branch and the presidency. But after considering Congress and the Supreme Court, the commission, whose report we're looking at today, makes no recommendations in that area. Should they have? You've just published a book entitled Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy. So how do you think about the relations of those 3 key terms?
Thanks, Eric. What a pleasure to be on this panel. Yes, they should have, in my view, grappled with the presidency, the powers that are allotted to the president, and because the president is important both coming and going. I mean, if we want to take seriously the challenge to democracy that we now face, we have to reckon with the fact that the presidency, in my view, is occupied by a populist who is doing remarkable damage to the norms that govern our democracy, the practices that make up our democracy, that there's an effort to not just channel critiques and anger, but to actually sow disaffection, to encourage a widespread sense that our democratic institutions are illegitimate. And this is a profound threat. Populism is a profound threat to health of our democracy, and populism right now is being channeled through the presidency and is leveraging the powers of the presidency in the service of advancing anti-democratic goals. We need to put that front and center. It's not so easy, though, as simply shutting down the presidency in order to preserve our democracy, because what we also need is a presidency that can solve problems, that can address the profound challenges that we as a country face. We aren't going to make headway in attending to some of the core sources of the anger and disaffection that propel populist sentiment without presidential leadership. And so we need to then find ways at once, and this is what we talk about, my co-author of the book is Terry Moe. Terry and I talk about in the book is how do you leverage on the one hand, the promise of presidential leadership, the promise that presidential leadership is attentive to national long-term concerns, while also recognizing the fear, that is, the possibility that when the presidency is occupied by a demagogue, all sorts of damage can be done to our democracy. And so it's a profound dilemma. And the work that then needs to be done is in the service of reconstituting the presidency. We need to reimagine the presidency. There's some powers that the presidents have now that they have no business having, and we need to think about how we either eliminate them or scale them back. And there are others that we ought to think about enhancing, not in the service of kind of lauding the individuals who occupy the presidency blindly or believing that somehow they have all the answers, but in order to responsibly leverage the kind of leadership that the presidency stands to offer in our system of separated powers. that we need that. We ought to be focusing squarely on the presidency if we want to think seriously about the crisis of democracy that stands before us.
Thank you. Judge Wood, the Supreme Court is mentioned 15 times in the report, more certainly than protest police or the presidency. And in the past few weeks, we've heard much about court packing, especially since the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, your colleague, to take her place. And so Americans have been reminded once again that the Constitution leaves significant aspects of the design of the Supreme Court to Congress. The Commission, of which you were a member, makes no recommendation on the size of the court, but it does recommend federal legislation to limit terms for justices on that court to 18 years, time to allow one new member to join and one older member to cycle off during each 2-year session of Congress, which would guarantee each president at least 2 picks. I wondered if you could maybe explain for our audience that particular recommendation, understanding that not all members of the commission endorse necessarily all aspects of the report.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And first of all, again, my thanks too to everybody for including me. And also, perhaps this should go without saying, but nothing I'm going to say should be understood as reflecting personally on anybody, not my colleague, not an existing justice. It's a more structural discussion. The problem I think that we saw is that over a sustained period of time during Democratic administrations, Republican administrations, the Supreme Court has begun feeling like a committee of Congress where the press wants to say Justice X, parenthesis, Reagan, Justice Y, parenthesis, George W. Bush, Justice Z, parenthesis, Obama. And it's a development that has caused people, I think, to question whether there really is a rule of law or whether this is just one final political trump card that can, excuse the term, that can be played. And so we started with that. We need a Supreme Court that is trusted by people, that is regarded as an impartial arbiter of decisions, and that has become imperiled in recent time. A second thought was that if you like originalism, if you like looking back at what people thought they were structuring as a Supreme Court, the people who wrote the Constitution in 1787 did not think they were creating an institution that somebody was going to spend 45 years on. Life expectancies, I just double checked this, for somebody, for a man, and of course in those days it would have been men, who reached the age of 50 was just another 18 years, and so not even 70. So there was a certain turnover inherent in that, a certain refreshing of the institution. And also, because of that, less political overtones. As you all know, I mean, some of the people who've been discussing the very sad event of Justice Ginsburg's passing and say, oh, she should have retired at an earlier time. Our justice is going to aim their retirements so that the right president can appoint them. So we're trying to back off from all of that and see whether this 18-year proposal, which was not unique to us, it's been in the literature for many years, would be a better way of doing it. And the one other aspect of it that I want to emphasize is we were looking for solutions that didn't require a constitutional amendment. And it was our view that this didn't, because actually people do not cease becoming judges after 18 years on this idea. People instead transition to different kinds of judicial duties, either sitting on the courts of appeals, which is exactly what retired Justice David Souter has been doing ever since he left the court 10 years ago or so. And there have even been other thoughts of potential work on the Supreme Court. Now, the justices have not always had exclusively Supreme Court duties. You'll all remember that when the court was first instituted, they spent most of their time riding circuit, sitting as trial judges. They did that until 1891 when that was passed. So for really a very significant period of our history, the judicial duties that they have been understood as different from the actual title. And you can scour Article 3, I guarantee you, and you're not going to see anything about judicial duties in that language.
Thank you very much. I'd like now to turn from the sort of discussions of the last few months to the opening of the report itself. The Commission, in its opening section, identifies a number of challenges to American democracy: lack of trust in the federal government and in one another, economic inequality, low voter turnout and obstacles to voting, ingrained voting systems like single-member districts and winner-take-all elections, a fragmented civil society, an unhealthy civic culture, social media, a lack of shared narratives of common purpose. What, in your opinion, and this is a question for each of you in turn, are the central challenges to American democracy? And are there ones in the report that you would want to particularly highlight, or ones outside of the report that you would want to add? And let's start with Will.
A thing that I really like about this report is its broad scope and its ambition. The idea that we're going to meaningfully grapple with the crisis that stands before us by doing little things in circumscribed ways is folly. We've got to think big and imaginatively and creatively. And the report does a really nice job of highlighting the importance and issues surrounding representation, responsiveness, inclusion, thinking about how we increase participation, increase the set of voices that are heard, and increasing the incentives of people in positions of power to actually respond to those voices. I think, given your question, I want to add to the mix, not just highlight one that's already on the table, but add to the mix, because a thing that the report doesn't highlight, but that I think should highlight, is the performance of government. That is, the capacity of our institutions to actually solve problems, to actually do something. It's not just a question of whose voices are heard. It's a question of whether or not problems, real, are attended to in a serious-minded way. Can we actually get traction on rising inequality between the rich and the poor? Can we actually attend to global climate change, not just whose voices are heard about those various issues? And I think there are a whole host of reasons why institutionally our political system is ill-equipped to solve problems, and we ought to be thinking about how we move forward in this way. I mean, to sort of gesture back to my previous response about the presidency, I think the president is key as a part of solving problems, and we need to be thinking about how we can move forward in that way. One last thing: a failure of government to solve problems that we're seeing, kind of particularly modern problems associated with globalization, immigration, automation, big structural changes, have set in motion a lot of the anger and harm and disaffection and bigotry that is corroding our democracy. So it isn't just another thing that we ought to add to the list. It is kind of, to my mind, in many ways, it stands behind a lot of the more proximate concerns that we have about the health of our democracy.
Thank you so much. I see Tracy nodding. How about if we turn to you next?
I was nodding, I think, because one of the things that I noticed about the report is that, in addition to aiming at a understandably high level, there's a lot of focus on federal institutions, not exclusively so, and understandably so. So as William is talking about the presidency, I'm thinking, yes, but policing is a fundamentally state and local issue, and there's nothing that the president really is going to do other than make speeches that often make people angry, but at the end of the day, doesn't necessarily change how policing is carried out. In New Haven, Connecticut, where I live, there are things that the federal government can do about policing, which of course is related to Sue's discussion about what folks are protesting about right now. But at the end of the day, not a lot. And when you are thinking about how government is going to carry out these critical services, one has to be very attentive to federalism concerns and thinking about interlocking relationships between federal, state, and local government. So I guess the primary reason why I was nodding is thinking about the difference between assessing and enhancing the members of the demos, as opposed to thinking about the conversations we have about, in Bonnie Honig's term, political theorist Bonnie Honig's term, what are the public things that we care about? And I think when I'm reading the report, there's a high level discussion about the importance of those public things, but there's a bit of a disjuncture between thinking about who is entitled to talk about the public things and how we're actually going to talk about it. There's a part in the report that talks about K-12 education and civic education. There's a part in the report that discusses John Dewey, who, while we're counting particular words used by folks, John Dewey has never written in any of his at least scholarly writings, never wrote, at least to the best I could tell, one word about race, not even one, which is a very central issue and what we're talking about here. So I guess I would, a really important issue in understanding how to enhance trust in our key government institutions is to shift our conversation to a discussion of public things, I think, like policing, like schools, and some of the other issues that William was talking about. Not really sure about how reconstructing the presidency has anything to do with that, but maybe.
Yeah, I think the report, I really agree with what Will said about how ambitious the report is. It's honestly, I opened it thinking, when I first read it, thinking, well, there's probably going to be some, pretty language in here, but boy, there's some really pretty substantial and some probably unrealizable proposals, but they're terrific and they're worth thinking about. And some of them I think are realizable. And so hats go off to Judge Wood and her colleagues for the job that they did. If I had a magic wand and could wave it and solve one problem in the United States, and nobody's given me that magic wand yet, I can't understand why, it would be to remake our system of electoral administration. So that sounds super boring, but I study electoral systems in other countries around the world, and I can tell you we have just about the worst system of electoral administration in any democracy. And that holds for democracies that are, that should be worse than us, and they're not. So I'm sure Will has heard me tell this story many times before. In 2006, I was giving a talk at the electoral, what was then known as the the Federal Institute of Elections in Mexico. So this is a kind of independent agency overseeing elections, the equivalent of which many countries have. And a young man pulled me aside and said, we've just done a full redistricting of the country. This is a very large country. And can I show you an exhibit about it? So yes, of course. And he opened his laptop, and basically what he showed me was they input some, a couple of basic numbers about the existing districts, push a button, an algorithm does a trick, and lo and behold, there's your new set of districts. We know what a nightmare redistricting is in most states in our country, and how utterly politicized it is, and how it, not everywhere, but in many states, is basically a power grab by whichever party happens to be in power at the state level. I think our system of very decentralized electoral administration is in many ways embedded in there, in part because of our racial conflict in this country, and for historical reasons. I don't imagine it would be easy to undo, but it's a terrible mess. So the proposals that from the commission that are related to electoral administration and electoral rules, I really heartily endorse. I'll just throw in one other thing, that this goes back to the conversation some of the things that Tracy mentioned and have come up around the police. The police, local police forces are not supposed to be representative institutions. We don't elect them and that sort of thing. But we have police forces and we have police unions. And I'll tell you that in Chicago, I think the 82% of the vote went for Hillary Clinton in the presidential election in 2016. And we have a police union that has just endorsed Donald Trump for re-election. So there's absolutely no correspondence between the kind of, worldview preferences, views of race relations and so forth of this important police union and the general population. So, if you were an anthropologist and you were dropped down in some society and you had sort of a minority that controlled the means of repression and was completely at odds with the with the majority, you would think, well, that's not very sustainable, and it sounds like a formula for lots of problems. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think I'm going to be building on a little bit of what Sue said. I've actually had the experience a couple of times of being involved in redistricting disputes. I was doing Wisconsin after the 2010 election. And I want to say a couple of things. One of them is that fundamentally, all of our aspirations for democracy, all of our bromides about democracy are going to fail if we don't create our institutions appropriately, if we don't get legislatures that are actually representative of the people they're supposedly speaking for. If you don't have a legislature like that, you're not going to have the right kind of controls on presidential power. They largely come from legislation. But if the Congress or the state legislature vis-a-vis the governor just doesn't do its job, then you have a gap and you have a very unsatisfactory situation. So one of our recommendations, I think Sue was alluding to it, was to try to depoliticize the process of apportioning both state level seats for any type of post you may have in the state that requires districting. A lot of states have senatorial districts as well as representative districts, so that's why I say that. And seats for the House of Representatives. It's a disaster now. Back in the day, let's say even probably around 1950, if you were going to redistrict a state, maybe you would look at counties, maybe you would look at cities, maybe you would look at precincts. You would have a certain amount of data to look at, but there was only so much you could manipulate it. I guarantee you, with the programs available right now, you can have a computer draw an infinite number of equally sized districts so that one person, one vote is complied with. But, if you happen to be the Democrats in charge, as they were in Illinois after 2010, it turns out to be pretty big thumb on the scale for districts that will produce Democratic representatives. Stacking and packing, you can pile all the Republicans into one district so they don't have a moderating voice in the other districts, or I could switch the parties around and it would be Wisconsin, it would be the Republicans doing the same thing. Well, that causes downstream effects. It causes candidates to appeal to the extreme members of their party, not to the population as a whole. It really harms the whole process, and also, of course, makes people feel, large amounts of the population feel disconnected to the legislature. So I think fixing it at the front end, and redistricting is one thing, but the other thing we called for, understanding that a constitutional amendment is hard, but we did call for something that legitimizes the regulation of the money that gets thrown into these races, because as I like to put it, we really should have a one person, one vote system, not a $1, one vote system. And I'm afraid we are awfully close to $1, one vote right now.
Judge Wood, I'd like to stay on that. The first section of the report of its recommendations, like the first section of the Constitution itself, is about achieving greater representation. And there are a number of strategies, one of which is to increase the size of the House of Representatives. Another one is to introduce ranked choice voting. Another is to reintroduce in some places multi-member districts. And the aspect of the Supreme Court term limits is one we've already talked about. And you've just mentioned the amendment. And out of the 31 ambitious recommendations, that's the only one that would require a constitutional amendment, although many of them would require substantial ordinary legislation. So the commission recommends an amendment concerning congressional regulation of election contributions and spending to eliminate the undue influence of money in our political systems. As you've just said, amendments are notoriously difficult to pass. Can you say a little bit more about why the commission felt that this should be the 28th Amendment?
Sure. I mean, let me give you one insight into the thinking of the commission. We, believe me, as some of you have said this is not the time to think small. You know, we need to think as big as the problem seems to be. But on the other hand, there were certain areas, and this is one of them, where we thought, let's come up with a staged set of proposals. There may be some things that we can do right now that can be done that will help this problem even without an amendment. And so the recommendation right after the amendment, recommendation 1.6, was to take advantage of the little space that the Citizens United decision leaves and call for transparency. You know, one could do a lot more with insisting on disclosure of who the actual real parties and interests are who are giving money to different parts of campaigns. And I think you could make it applicable to PACs, you could make it applicable to anything. And frankly, you know, it's a little surprising to me that we don't do more, because I promise you, if you file a brief in my court, the first page of the brief is a disclosure statement about who has an interest in this case. And you can't just say it's the XYZ LLC or corporation. If somebody else owns more than 10% of it, you've got to dig back, because we need to know, you know, do we have to recuse ourselves? So this is quite doable. But the ultimate thought was that if you assume as a given that the Supreme Court is going to say that spending money is just a way of exercising your free speech rights, and I think that's probably a decent summary of Citizens United, I don't want to get rid of the First Amendment. I don't know anybody else who wants to get rid of the First Amendment. I am a huge believer in free speech. The line between speech and conduct, if you want to think of spending money as conduct, is something that people argue about, but it really distorts the electoral process. It's as though the people with a lot of money have a very large megaphone and they stand on top of a huge tower and shriek. And the people who don't have the money don't have the megaphone, and it's much harder, maybe not impossible, but much harder for them to organize. So we thought, again, get the machinery of government working properly, and then the outcomes ought to follow without much trouble.
There's a strand of this that I'd like to take and kind of amplify, which is that I think we all agree that what we need is a big movement to resuscitate our democracy, and there are lots of objectives in hand. And I think one challenge with this kind of work has to do with, you know, what does it take to pass a constitutional amendment? It's really hard to do. There's that challenge. There's another challenge, though, which is that there are tensions between these objectives. And I think we have to then think about trade-offs. So I want to just identify one, and it has to do with the reform that you pointed to, which has to do with increasing the size of the House of Representatives. Right? The argument for doing so is that now we have each member of the House represents something on the order of 750,000 residents. And that seems like the House has become too distant from the will of the people. And by increasing the size of the House, then we will put the House sort of more in closer approximation to average citizens, and that would be to the good. If you resuscitate this objective that I think we ought to have as well, which is the capacity of our institutions to solve problems, the idea of going from 535 voting members in Congress to something like 750 voting members of Congress, what that will do is just make this collective decision-making body all the more kind of unwieldy. And the parochialism that already is channeled through this institution will only be amplified. Its capacity to provide leadership and representation on the big challenges that we as a country face and where we are failing again and again, a coherent healthcare system, our unbelievably embarrassing response to COVID and our failures there, the incoherence of the tax code, the rising inequality between the rich and the poor, like these like foundational problems that we can't get a handle on, that we better get a handle on. The idea that we increase the size of Congress, to my mind, strikes me as a setback. But you kind of can also see how that there are these representational advantages to be had when you pay attention to other criteria. So there we go. When you asked, like, what is our preferred objective? There's a lot in there, because I think it forces us to then think about these trade-offs and how we want to play one off against another.
Can I just comment briefly on this proposal? I agree with a lot of what you said, and some people said, why 50? Why not 500? If you're really trying to do this. I think that some of these recommendations were silently playing off against one another. And I'm thinking especially of the Electoral College, which of course follows the number of people in the House, in the Congress in general. But there's only so much you can do with amending that will make any difference. You have to stay in the House side because of this weird little clause right at the end of Article 5, that even with the amendment power, no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So you can't fuss around with the Senate. I guess you could amend that. I don't know, but it seemed to be a fairly fixed thing. So the only thing you could do to somehow equalize the power of the states was to change the House of Representatives. Now, maybe this would all be beside the point if you just fix the Electoral College, which was another thought.
I'd like to turn to the next section, which is on voting, and will give us a chance to talk about a number of these issues. But I guess as a question to all of you, should we be thinking of voting as a right, as a privilege, or as a duty? And the reason I ask is that one of the most provocative recommendations in the report is that voting should become a requirement of citizenship, with non-voters subject to a small fine or citation, which is a system inspired by Australia's, and one that would allow citizens to vote for none of the above. The report, the commission notes that this may at first seem un-American or undemocratic. I guess I ask you, and I would have asked Tom Ginsburg had he been here, because I know he had strong feelings about this. Why isn't it un-American or undemocratic to institute compulsory or mandatory voting?
I'll jump in. I don't want to monopolize, but I will say one thing about this. I think this recommendation is spot on. I think it's a terrific recommendation. And the reason is that not only have other efforts to get out the vote and motor voter registration efforts, campaigns to increase turnout have underwhelmed in terms of their returns. There's some evidence out there that in fact it's yielded an electorate that is actually less representative of what we have now, that marginal changes in the composition of the electorate needn't, if what we had is sort of a random sample of people and all voices were adequately heard, it'd be great. But when shifting from 58 to 63, you have more people voting, but you can actually have that be less representative. And so the move here to go in big strikes me as a productive effort to actually recover a much more representative electorate. And it forces people to have kind of buy-in. It's much harder to sort of disavow a government that you were forced to participate, the selection of who's running it. Those are forces for good.
That's great. And I see Tracy has unmuted herself, and I wanted to ask her specifically about the proposition of restoring voting rights to convicted felons. But you want to speak to this too?
I do, and I'll tie the two things together. I don't have strong thoughts on your question about what's un-American as distinguishing among duties, rights, and so on. And I hesitate to say what I'm about to say as a mere lawyer. in a room full of political scientists. But I think it's interesting to tie what you're talking about with the social psychological research on legal socialization. So I literally today just turned in a paper to the Journal of Social Inquiry, which is doing a 40-year retrospective on Lewin, Tapp, and Levine's work on legal socialization. And I think one way to understand a duty to vote is that it's an incredibly important aspect of socializing people about civic republicanism, actually. And when you're looking at state constitutions, which is what I did with my co-author, Benjamin Justice, in this paper, we were examining the ways in which the law recognizes its own duty to socialize folks legally. And we did that by examining different provisions in state constitutions and preambles and Bill of Rights and suffrage provisions, provisions about education, and provisions about criminal law. And that, of course, state constitution is where all the action is in terms of thinking about who gets to vote, because the U.S. Constitution doesn't say very much about that. Right? The states do all of the work, and when you're reading those constitutions, you can see the ways in which states have managed that by focusing on the importance of property, to then thinking about the importance of basically conferring a property interest in white men and their ability to vote, and taking away the right to vote from people who are convicted of crimes, right? And I do think that kind of mandating and explaining a duty to vote is an important role in, as I said, in engaging this project of legal socialization. It makes it much more difficult to take it away. And going back to your question about felony disenfranchisement, it is already the case that not every state has commonly disenfranchises people who have been convicted of crimes. In Maine and in Vermont, one can vote even while in prison. There's no particular reason why we have to do that. And in other countries, it is not the case that people are disenfranchised simply because they have committed a crime. One can hold these two thoughts, right, in one's head at the same time. So I share Will's enthusiasm for this proposal, absolutely, but also just gesturing towards getting people to think a lot about what our state constitutions do. I'm going to be the cheerleader for state and local government in this conversation. We spend much too little time thinking about what those governments do, what they have the capacity to do, and actually what their obligations are in this regard.
So I want to say me three. I also really love this proposal. I think that I didn't have a chance to go over this part of the report before this meeting, but I believe it refers to so in Australia, compulsory voting doesn't mean you have to vote. It means you have to go to the polling place and you have to do something. And one of the things you can do is, I believe they call it a donkey vote in Australia, and which seems like it should be a kangaroo vote or something. But anyway, you can go and cast like none of the above, or a blank ballot. So that can be actually quite important. So clarifying that the duty is to go and emit an opinion of some kind. So the anecdote I'll tell you is in Argentina. So many Latin American countries also have compulsory voting, as do other. Belgium's had compulsory voting. In Argentina, there was an election in 2001 in the midst of a terrible, terrible economic crisis. And many people went to the polls and voted sort of basically none of the above. And furthermore, they found very colorful ways of expressing this none of the above. So they have what's known as a party ballots, where you don't click a machine, you sort of deposit a piece of paper in an envelope, and that's your vote. And I'll leave it to your imagination some of the things that were deposited in envelopes. This was a great crisis. So I think none of the above that year was the second most voted option in Argentina. And this was a great source of embarrassment and upset among the political class, among leaders of the political parties, who began to talk about, well, do we really want to have compulsory voting? So it put pressure on them, and they pressure to kind of get their act together. It's an important. I think it's an important. What do we know as social scientists? So Tracy said unnecessarily self-deprecating things about being a lawyer. But what do we know as social scientists about the effects of compulsory voting? So mostly what we know is it increases turnout, as you'd expect. It has been believed that it might improve voters' knowledge, citizens' knowledge about politics and public policy. And that doesn't seem necessarily to be the case. So it does seem to be that people can go to the polls as kind of a matter of course to keep their documents up to date, and not necessarily learn that much about public policy or matters of public affairs. So I think that compulsory voting would work nicely in conjunction with some of the kind of civic education aspects of what the commission has proposed. There has been some concern that compulsory voting increases partisanship. And do we really want our society to be more partisan and more polarized? That seems not necessarily to be the case. So one of the things that's interesting to think about is compulsory voting changes the strategies of voters. You basically go to vote because you don't want to, pay a fine or whatever. It also changes the strategies of political parties. So they don't spend time getting out the vote because the state does that for them. They spend time trying to persuade people to vote for them. And that can have interesting downstream effects as well. So yeah, all for it as well. All for it, but not overpromising that it automatically in and of itself has all of the good effects that we might think it would.
I'll just say that I hope that the rest of you are ready to study these effects. I've been getting COVID cases of various kinds, as have all the other judges in the country, about people who are complaining about mask wearing, and people are complaining about, their inability to go to bars, and people are complaining about various measures, even in the face of Supreme Court decisions from quite some time ago. There's a fascinating 1905 case about a smallpox epidemic in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the court goes on and on about the values of vaccination, and of course the state and local authorities can require these things. So I think we need to understand how people maybe who aren't like us are going to look at this. And I think there's some secondary effects that would be really interesting to study. Number one, is it going to have an effect on the legislative push to make it harder to become a registered voter, whether it's voter ID laws or whether it's, pay all your fines, even if you're a felon, or, whatever? Is it going to have an effect on that? Is it going to have an effect on how easy it is to get to the polls? Because remember, one of the other recommendations was that we should move Election Day to Veterans Day so that it would be a national holiday. So for the people who can't take advantage of early voting or vote by mail or other options, they can actually get there without having time off from their employer being a problem. There are a lot of people who frankly can't use that. So we've got all these hidden barriers, and maybe if we made voting mandatory, some of those might fall. They should if we make voting mandatory.
Before we turn to the audience's questions, and there are many of them in our Q&A stream, I wanted to ask you about the last third of the report, which is on culture. And maybe one way to particularly focus this discussion is around social media, which I know is a topic that Tracy has studied. And that's that some see social media as an important tool for community engagement and political engagement, while many others experience it as an environment that undermines trust and trustworthiness and helps create a world where different groups have their own sets of facts. What has social media done to democracy? is the first question. And what could it do for democracy? Can the platforms that are be redesigned to help support rather than erode our constitutional democracy? And Tracy, I know that your center at Yale, the Justice Collaboratory, has a social media governance issue. How do you, maybe we'll start with you, how do you address those issues?
I want to gesture toward something Will said at the very beginning, which is one of the things he liked about the report was the ways in which it points to some, in many cases, small in the context of the big questions and issues we're addressing, things we can do to move forward on the basis of a set of really serious issues. So let me just say a little bit about what we're doing in our social media governance initiative, which is that one thing we're doing is to not focus so much on questions of content moderation, which I think bring in issues of democracy or conversations about how we understand democracy by focusing on what many people in that arena think of as First Amendment type issues and free expression, and instead think much more about pro-social engagement. Because again, relying on theories of social psychology, we know a lot about what kinds of things members of the public are looking for when they're trying to come to conclusions about the fairness of authorities, whether that authority is the president, Will's favorite subject, or judges, Diane, or school teachers, or social media platforms, right? And we know that people care about four things. They care about having what we call voice, an opportunity to tell their side of the story, or opportunities to have input in rules and regulations that are relevant to the context in which they're operating. They care a lot about being treated with dignity and respect, concern for their rights. They care about what they think of as fair decision-making, decisions made on the basis of facts, neutrality, lack of bias, and they care about being able to ascertain the motives of whatever authority they're dealing with. And they make those decisions based on how they're treated, as opposed to the outcomes of a particular decision, whether a decision favors them or not. And so in the context of social media, you can use these ideas to think about the architecture and infrastructure of these online habitats, really. And instead of thinking about the rules of what's posted or what's taken down, you think much more about the infrastructure of what's there and how people are engaging one another. It's kind of like thinking about a car as a dangerous technology. Content moderation is about, well, are we going to ban the car or not? Whereas the infrastructure conversation is, are we going to put rumble strips on the road? Are we going to have better lighting, right? Are we going to think about the architecture of how the car/words travel in the space. And so one of the things I find really interesting about dealing with a bunch of social media platforms in this regard is the difference between text, think Twitter or Facebook, and newer platforms such as Clubhouse. I don't know if any one of you has heard of Clubhouse. Right now it's in beta and it's invitation only, but it's simultaneous voice interaction. So you're on it and you're in a room with a bunch of people and you're talking, right? It's not pictures and it's not text. And I think these kinds of things can tell us a lot, really, both about how to move forward in a productive way, especially if your goal is pro-social engagement, which is what ours is, as opposed to looking at the ways in which the social media platforms we're really used to engaging in right now, the text-based nature of it does lead to high salience of division and fracturing and people being unkind. Speaking of the words of the report, Eric noted in some of our pre-work that there is a great mention in the civic section about love. There's not a lot of love in Twitter, but more so, actually, you'd be surprised if you're in Clubhouse, where there is voice, where people actually have to talk to one another.
That's great. Do other members of the panel want to address that, or we can move into the audience questions?
I'll just say one thing, which is a shout out to our colleague, Kathy Cohen, who's done a lot of work in this space. And a thing that concerns her and her colleagues are notions of, what do we count as political? Who is political? And I think we're accustomed to thinking about the young and people who are Black and brown as being less political or at the margins when you use traditional measures of political engagement, like donating to campaigns or running for office and the like. And she's really interested in digital media as a way of understanding the political engagement of people who are young, Black, and brown. And when you expand your purview to include these kinds of activities, you come to very different kinds of conclusions about, who is who is entering that public square and trying to affect our democracy.
All right, thanks so much. So we have quite a few questions, and we have about 20 minutes to try to answer some of them. One of them is very easy. It's just to give the name of the report and the commission again. The name of the report is Our Common Democracy, Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. The commission is the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship. And this report is available from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I think it's if you search for some of those terms, you will turn it up. Many of the questions turn on the nature of compulsory voting. So let me try to pull some of them together. One of them is, what does the panel think about instituting compulsory voting without instituting ranked choice voting? Or maybe I'll just, let me bundle a few of these. Would compulsory voting help address the problem of voter suppression? Will compulsory or mandatory voting result in an even less informed electorate?
Even after you account for all of the voter suppression measures that make it difficult for people to register to vote, and there are a lot of problems with that. I was trying to find information about registered voters who did not vote in the 2016 election. And it's really quite a few. Among Democrats, 44% of registered voters did vote and 35% didn't. Among Republicans, it was not that different. 46% did vote, 32% didn't. Independents, 10 and 33% didn't. So huge numbers of people who've already jumped through all the hoops to be able to vote are nonetheless not voting. And that's why actually I think we included the more cultural part of the report. People need to feel that it matters if they vote. They need to feel inspired to vote. Now, I think compulsory voting might actually make it feel like it's just one of those things you do. You get a notice for jury service, you show up. You need to vote, you show up and do it. But we were trying to find some way to attack that very sorry set of statistics that I just rattled off.
So I really liked Judge Wood's earlier comment that, basically you have to think about if you were to implement mandatory voting, it would be a new equilibrium that would presume some other things with it. I mean, you don't have mandatory voting and a crazy system of voter registration. Mostly you have, if you look around the world, you have compulsory voting in systems in which you have a very, centralized and frequently updated and nonpartisan, non-political voter registration system. If you make people vote and they're going to pay a fine if they don't, then they're not going to put up with having very few polling places or very few places to send their ballot or an iffy mail-in voting system. It just doesn't, it wouldn't make sense. And it might take some time to kind of get all those kinks out of the system, but it would presumably both go with and force a change in a lot of how we administer elections and how we manage voter registries. I think, Eric, your previous point about, if it's hard to get people to wear masks, how are you going to get them to, comply happily or even unhappily with compulsory voting? It's a great question. It is complied with in systems in which there are real sanctions, there are real fines because there are many countries that have on the books have compulsory voting, but they don't sanction non-voting. So if you have real sanctions, it does work. It doesn't necessarily mean that immediately it's something that people are happy about, but there are lots of things that we make ourselves do. We make ourselves pay taxes. Most of us, we make ourselves serve on jury duty. Lots of things, that we have to do that sort of go with citizenship.
Thanks. Another bundle of questions deals with the Electoral College, and I can tell you that a recent book by the historian Alexander Kaiser at Harvard notes that of the many proposals for amendments over the last 2 centuries, none have been so prominent as attempts to reform the Electoral College. The commission leaves the Electoral College intact, hoping to adjust things through expanding the House. But here's a question from one participant who's watching online. Judge Wood mentioned a belief in a one person, one vote system. Could you expand on how that applies to what you think should be done with the Electoral College? And I invite everyone to sort of weigh in on that.
Well, I'll just say very quickly, if you think that we are allocating representatives appropriately, you wind up with a problem at the small state end, where you have 1 or 2 representatives in the state and 2 senators, and things get out of whack pretty quickly in terms of the way the popular vote gets translated into the votes that actually count for the presidency. We have an historical analogy where we did change things, and that's with the membership of the Senate. Of course, it was the 17th Amendment that changed the Senate from being people appointed by the state legislatures to directly elected people. And maybe we should have taken that next step and just said, we've done it before, we can do it again, let's just take care of this.
Yes. We should. Yeah, I mean, I'm all for it. I think among presidency scholars, my tribe, I don't know of any serious-minded person who wants to stand up and stick by the Electoral College. They see it as profoundly anti-democratic. It introduces all kinds of pathologies in how campaign funds not just are collected but spent. And introduces like these instances. We've had 2 in the last 20 years. Lord help us that we have another one in a couple of weeks, wherein the person who gets the plurality of votes or a majority of votes even doesn't become president, and all that sets in motion when you think about anger and disaffection and a sense that things are terribly awry. It should go.
And I may be out over my skis here, but it's profoundly anti-democratic for, I would say, a particular reason, but at least one reason that many of us know about that is still relevant and persistent today, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about protection of slaveholding interest. We know this.
Sue, did you want to join this?
Well, I'd love to say, comparative research tells us that the electoral colleges do this or that, but there is none because we are unique. So, American exceptionalism. There have been 1 or 2 very brief kind of experiments with electoral college, indirect election kind of thing around the world in presidential systems, and nobody has it. So it's a terrible institution for many reasons.
Let's turn to the final section of the report. There's a question here that strikes me as very University of Chicago. It manages to mention both Hannah Arendt, who taught here briefly in Will and Sue's department, I think, and also Danielle Allen, who also taught here, and who is one of the chairs of the commission that produced this report. I won't read that part, but the real question is, do you think that political theory, participation, democracy should be emphasized or required more in high schools and colleges? And that's certainly one of the things that is pressed in the final section of this report.
So I'll just mention that, yes, and there's a wonderful course that's being taught, has started to be taught at many colleges and universities around the country beginning in 2017. It started as an initiative out of Brown University, and it's called Democratic Erosion, and it's about what is democracy, what sustains it, how can it erode, what are effective forms of resistance. I think it's now being taught at something like 45 institutions, including the University of Chicago. I'm teaching it currently. We have about 65 students, and it's being taught in the DC jail, and it's being taught at a number of international universities. There's a thirst among our students, among our very bright students, to understand better what it is they're seeing around them and how basic institutions of democracy work. So I think there's a great unmet demand, and I really salute the parts of the report that talk about this issue.
Terrific. Here's just a question that I think speaks to maybe the constitutional amendment, but also the question of Citizens United. The questioner writes, I feel that democracy has become more about representing businesses than people. How do we redefine democracy to once again represent people?
Well, I can throw in this is only me speaking, but if you look at Citizens United, you see the court making an analogy between other groups and people choosing to get together in a group to make their views known, whether it's their church or whether it's, Save the Whales or, whatever it is. People participate, and de Tocqueville mentioned this, everybody does, in all sorts of groups. And so the court said, well, so what's a corporation? It's just another kind of group. And so why not let them be the same kind of aggregator of viewpoints? But the problem is a corporation isn't just another group. It's actually a separate legal entity. And on top of that, if you want to be a stockholder in a corporation that makes widgets, maybe you don't necessarily want to have to sign on to the viewpoint of the management of that corporation on such issues as the death penalty or abortion or global climate change, or you just want a widget. And it's very harsh to say, well, you can always sell your stock, because that's not so easy. First of all, a lot of people are in big institution-run stock plans. So this analogy that the court made is critical, and I think the person who asked the question is right to focus on the serious question whether we've gone too far in equating business organizations with individual humans.
And another shout out to colleagues, to Tracy's Jacob Hacker in political science. He and his regular co-author Paul Pearson at UC Berkeley have a new book out, Let Them Eat Tweets, I think it's called. And it builds on a long body of research that they've done that talks about the rise of moneyed interests, not just in terms of their disproportionate representation in our democracy, but how moneyed interests have grabbed a hold of the machinery of government and the pathologies that follow from that. It's interesting and rich stuff.
This is another question in the same vein, and it might be our final question. And it comes from someone who identifies as a high school junior here in Chicago. The person writes that they go to a pretty good school that makes us take civics in freshman year for a quarter, 10 weeks. But the only thing covered was the role of citizens. In an AP US history class, the teacher briefly talked about the structure of our government, but never addressed the failures. My question is, what is the role and responsibility of schools and teachers when teaching us about the structure of the government? And what is the responsibility of young people, not just voters, but high schoolers in pertaining to reinventing our democracy? So speaking to the youth will be our final question.
Can I go? I'm not going to answer, but I just want to say, I'm sorry, that is such an awesome question. And it's really an opportunity for me to follow up with something that Sue said before, and connect with some of the work that I mentioned earlier, which is, the United States Constitution doesn't guarantee anyone a right to education, but every single state constitution does. And they do, if you go back to the early republic constitutions and you look at the guarantees in the state constitutions at that time, they focus on pretty typical Enlightenment goals around ideas of diffusion of knowledge. But they had a very particular idea at that time, which was that diffusion of knowledge was going to make people better citizens, that we established common schools in the public schools, so that you, as the junior in high school, although the schools weren't structured in that way at that time, could be a member of society and make government better. That was the point. And over time, we've changed our conception of education and especially in public schools, to focus a lot more on skills and jobs, and maybe, this isn't what Judge Wood meant, but making widgets, rather than making democracy. And so I would say, the fact that you are so interested in this yourself, I think is probably going to be enough impetus for you to power on and learn more. And it gives me encouragement to demand more of my local and state legislatures, because that's where the action is going to be and where it's going to change to make this better for you and your classmates, if it's going to happen.
I'll add that there are a number of states too that have been taking this step to require a certain amount of civics education as a criterion that's got to be met in order to get a high school diploma. And just to try to give that message that this isn't one of these frill classes that you can throw out the window along with music, although I think that's a mistake too, but it's a really essential part of somebody's education.
And I guess I'll channel the spirit of the report that brought us here together today, which is that this civics education should not just be about informing individuals about what the institutions are and how one navigates them. They should also be about reimagining these institutions. Institutions are sticky, but they aren't fixed evermore. And if we really are going to be in the business of resuscitating and revitalizing our democracy, and if that's what we want our young people to be a part of, we need them to undertake the work of reimagining and reconstituting the institutions that govern our civic and political lives.
All right. Well, I think that that concludes our session. I do want to thank Dean Ann Robertson, President David Ataxby, Professors Will Howell, Tracy Mears, and Susan Stokes, and Judge Diane Wood, as well as the other members of the commission that produced this really ambitious and important report. Again, you can find it at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences website. And I hope that you will stay tuned for other events this afternoon as part of the University of Chicago's annual Humanities Day. Thank you again.